I especially requested Nazish because she has come about it in the way of any art student. She was a printmaker and has taught printmaking at the National College of Arts for many years. She was one of the 3 people involved in setting up the contemporary printmaking department at the college. And while she continued to be a painter, I think that was, the printmaking was to the forms. And the business of mark making was very important. This year, after a very long time, because she's been doing a lot of research as well, after a very long time, she came back to painting. And it was quite astonishing to see how she had made the connections of her research, which was looking at the history of how art has been taught in the subcontinent, her theoretical work, and work in the studio. So I think this is the edge which is being negotiated by some artists today, and I think some of these aspects are very special to the way that women practitioners are understanding and undertaking their own work. So Nazish Attaullah, who is on the faculty of the National College of Arts in the Department of Painting.
Well, since Salima has told you almost everything that, that I'm doing, I don't think I'll repeat that, but essentially what I'll do is I'll just go straight into the work. And what I'd like to say is that this particular body of work was executed in a very concentrated time period, about 6 weeks. Last November, and I showed the work in December in Lahore at a small gallery. And I went back to painting after a considerable length of time because although I trained as a painter, I went on to do printmaking and etching on metal plates in particular, and then printing from the etching plates. So actually going back to painting was a very interesting experience for me. One of the things that where there was a big departure from the kind of work that I had done previously was that I started, all the work that I had executed this time was on paper and not on canvas, not with oil paint, not in the traditional mode in which I had actually been taught at the National College of Arts. But I suppose that was also because I chose to work with paper, also because my experience of printmaking was to do with paper and making prints on paper from etching plates. And so in a sense I was more comfortable with it. And then in more formal terms as well, and in terms of the content of the work, I think that paper, with its particular fragility and vulnerability, was very much part of what I was attempting to do. In this work, the whole body of work has really 2 main concerns. And the first concern is an intellectual concern. I've been studying, particularly in the 19th century, I've been looking at why the British set up art schools in this region. I've studied people like Kipling very thoroughly. So this morning when Ratnavali was speaking about Havel, I could draw those similar sort of parallels with John Robert Kipling's work. And I'm looking at the hierarchies that got created between art and craft, and the distinctions that were made between art and craft, and that has been a major concern. And therefore, the work, my own work, negotiates, in a sense, the craft, if I put it that way, of stitching and embroidery and weaving. That is the kind of domain within which the work is produced. But then, I mean, it's all right having an intellectual concern or a deep intellectual concern and so on, and studying it and researching it and reading about it is one thing. But for any creative artist, I think that really it is that very emotive, personal experience which makes us which makes us do the work that we do. We make the work that we make, and that stems essentially from something that moves us sufficiently that really brings out some kind of a creative output. And hence, my second concern is really a very personal concern, and that is to do with the content of the work. So there is a sort of formal side to the work, and then there is the kind of underlying personal, emotional aspect to the work. And this is the first time that I'm actually talking about it, so I feel a bit I'd like to share it with you because the experience is to do with loss and to do with violence and to do with extreme trauma. This happened in 1998 on January 16, when Nazish Attaullah, who was my teacher and also a friend, a mentor, and his very young daughter, whom I had seen the day that she was born, were both brutally murdered in their home in Lahore. And I think that what happened was that I felt, as all of us were deeply traumatized by this incident, but somehow it was in my mind, and I started this particular body of work with images that came from this particular incident, and that is the kind of theme that in a sense runs through the entire exhibition or body of work. So I think what I'll do is I'm going to show the work to you in a chronological manner, and I think that has its own it's interesting to look at it like that, because you can see where one area is more important to me, and then where the other sort of concern overrides it and then becomes the major concern. And into it feed other concerns as well, which are to do with previous practice. Because I have always, on all my work, my previous work has been figurative or representational, and this work, the peculiarity about it is that it is non-figurative. And this is the first time that I've actually attempted to do something of this kind. Also, I may add that I've had very peculiar responses to the work. Most of the women, a lot of my friends who saw the work, seemed to respond to it instinctively. They somehow appreciated what I was doing or connected with it or was communicating to them in some way. Many of my friends who are men, on the other hand, had problems with this work. Shahid Jalal, for example, who's a great friend of mine, it came to my exhibition and I didn't say one word and went off, and I met him a few days after that in Pioneer store, and I said, well, Shahid, what did you think of the work? And he said, oh, well, that wasn't painting, that's craft. It was a very interesting comment. Similarly, other people who have been writing, the people who wrote about the work subsequently, again, it was women who could somehow, they had the perception to actually understand what I was attempting to do, and some of the men who wrote about it actually were at a bit of a loss. They really didn't know how to negotiate the work. So it is a little bit of a revelation. I'm not saying that they're all men, but nevertheless. So if we can have the lights off, I think I'll just start with the first painting. Now, I'm afraid because most of these paintings are monochromatic, you have to look a bit hard to be able to see what's going on in them. I mean, some of these slides are better than some others. Nevertheless, this was a diptych, which is 77 centimeters into 115 centimeters. And there are at least two pieces of paper side by side. Now, this paper is about 630 grammage paper, so it is very, very thick paper. And I called this painting Sunless Monday, and I labeled it 1 because there are 2, 3. Sunless Monday referring to the day that Zahoor and Jahara were killed and Anwar was badly injured and Alur was injured, all in the course of one afternoon. And when the burial took place, I was told that a post-mortem had been carried out on Jahara and Zahoor, and I found that whole idea of a post-mortem when they had already been brutalized, I mean a further brutalization, and I was so distressed by it actually that this is what happened in this work. So I have the black painting in which there are these sort of gashes or slashes which I'm actually creating by the use of all my printmaking tools. And in the red painting, red denoting blood, I have one sort of perforation which I have stitched over with thread and then painted the entire surface in thin washes of flat color. This was followed by another painting. The narrative is not a representational narrative. It is not what one would expect from the kind of work that I have done in the past. And yet it is another kind of narrative. And here I start looking at the sort of narrative that you find in Gantha embroidery, where you have this kind of running stitch. And so I made a fountain. And I stitched the water that was coming out of the fountain, and it was, again, the red was blood and could have been a fountain of blood. That was the kind of thought that was behind the actual image. But in it, the stitching was very, very meticulous, and each stitch had its own sort of position, and I was looking I was considering, this is where the other concern is, where I was looking and considering textiles and the stitching that was found in textiles. This is a small work, and again, this was called Sunless Monday 3, and I actually pierced the entire surface of the paper right through and made these kind of bullet-like shapes, which you could almost pull forward, and behind it I actually stitched into a finer piece of paper which I painted red and then stuck into the back of these bullets, so you could actually see the red somehow against this very dark black in front. This painting and the one after it are two smaller works. They are, again, I'm using acrylic paint and stitched thread on paper, and it is about 19 into 30 centimeters in terms of size, so it's quite an intimate size. And I use an etching tool to make all these lines. It's actually inside, it doesn't get reproduced as well as you could see it if you were looking at it in real life, because you don't really get the details. But essentially, I'm sort of incising lines, this kind of regular lines in the paper, and then piercing the paper with the point of a needle right through. And then there is this little indication which I've stitched of a missile. And I call the work Char Nivari. And of course, anyone who's familiar with previous work, my previous work, knows that I've worked on the Chadar and Char Nivari many years ago. And again, the Char Nivari, what is supposedly the safe area of the home, where of course there is this bomb or this menacing device which sort of sits within that so-called safety. The next. These are French knots, and each stitch was stitched by me into on this grid. And in some ways, this kind of formal concern was also a concern that Zahoor used in his own work, because many of his works, he used this whole, the grid and the unity of the grid, which was particular to his kind of working. And I'm appropriating some of the things from his work as well. And this was simple, it was just white on white, because it was a more formal painting in a sense. When Shanaz was showing you this Pulkari just now, which had this little yellow motif, where she said, we really don't know what this is all about, whether this is a guna or whether it is a signature or what is it. And that is what I had in mind when I did this work. And what I did was that these marks are quite thread-like in a sense, this kind of tactile feeling that is present in these marks, but it is all on one plane. And what I've done is I've excavated the paper with a scraper, which is a particular, you use it in etching. It's a sort of tool with which you use on a metal plate to make corrections. And then I just stitched this little motif and pierced the paper also with my needle. The motif doesn't really have any recognizable form, but it is, I call the painting minor imperfections. Again, this is a small diptych, and in it a similar technique is used to what was in the painting with the bullet sort of perforations. Throughout this work, I'm sort of cutting and piercing and scarring the surface, and then I'm also stitching it. And I thought about it afterwards. What was this experience all about for me? I mean, it was in a sense, the cutting and so on was like a surgeon takes a knife and sort of cuts something very precisely or sometimes very crudely. And then the stitching is the kind of healing and mending aspect of it. And I think that both these things were going on. There was the kind of very violent side to what I was experiencing, and then there was the healing or the soothing or the more contemplative side to the work. Maybe not the next one, please. This particular work and the one next to it I call a third way. And here what I did was that I actually I took a square piece of paper and I cut out another square from its center, and then I stitched the central square in this grid, and I painted it, and then I stitched it back into the frame. So I mean, it was very strange what I was doing, because I was just working incredibly hard and very meticulously, tying certain knots and putting things back in and trying to sort of refix things, like something that had been cut out, and then I was going to place it back in its original position, and then try to fit it in as perfectly as I could. And what I also did was that I didn't frame these paintings, and that has created some problems for some of the people who bought the work, but conventionally, because I wanted people to be able to actually look at the back, to look at the construction, because I felt that in a sense, the front was as important as the back of the work. And it was almost like when you look at a carpet, you look at the surface of the carpet and then you turn it round and you want to see the back of it because that's what tells you the sort of secret of how it was made. And similarly, as Shanaz was showing you, the front of a pulkari and then what the back of the pulkari looks like, and the idea was similar. I was also using, this is a similar painting to the one before, but I was using pig tea wash. I was using other pigments in a sense that were evocative in certain paintings of something else. And for example, some of these works have to do with really the senses of, say, the tactile sense, which is present, which you have seen up to now. But there is another work which is more to do with the sense of smell, and another work which is evocative of some other sense. So it's not just the visual sense, but the other senses which are at play as well, I think. This is a painting that I call Black Rain. And again, I was looking at a barrel. I was looking at, if you must have seen these embroidered galas, necks, which are sort of embroidered. I call it Black Rain because of that, for me, that contrast stage where sometimes it becomes larger, sometimes smaller, but it is all on one plane and all coming down into reaching this V. And all of this is actually one color. But because there is this variation on it, because the central V has been actually cut out and then stitched back in again to fit back into that V, it gives you an illusion of another color. And then there is this kind of meticulous kind of piercing of the paper throughout where the stitches are made, and even where the stitches are not there, there is an indication of the surface being pierced. So also that the edges of the paper are deckled edges because this is handmade paper, and the edges, I haven't tried to cover the edges in any way, but left them as they are, as free floating. In this painting, which I call the silent pain of healing. Again, it is acrylic on paper, and here the paper, what I've done is I've got two papers overlapping each other. And of course, by looking at it, one does think of Rothko immediately, and of that kind of contemplative side where I'm looking at Rothko, I'm aware of that somewhere in my subconscious. I'm thinking of that contemplative nature to his work, that kind of spiritual content to the work, the kind of thing that makes you calm down and you negotiate. That's why I call it the silent pain of healing, because you are actually dealing with something which is very painful, but you're trying to come to terms with it in some way. And hence there is no attempt to introduce any element of representation which I think would detract from it. I mean, this is what I felt very strongly. And hence there are just there are these horizontal lines which are and also that these two papers, when they are overlapped, they are actually stuck on the edges, and the center is actually left unstuck. Just when the paper goes up a little bit, that central portion, about 6-8 inches of that, is left unstuck. So it is a bit of, it allows something that is sort of going on inside. And I dealt with this concept earlier as well, where I was working with a conch shell. I was very conscious of the outer form, and then of that inner hidden world, or that world which is a private world, or a secret world, or a very personal world. then something, while you're doing body work, other things happen also. And I was considering apparel, so I was looking at what we wear in terms of apparel, but then I was considering what that apparel covers, and it is our skins and our body. And so looking at skin and working with pigments, and I actually made this color using Kashmir Child. So it was not really the regular tea wash with regular black tea, but it was the Kashmir Child, which had this kind of pinkish tone, which to me was very close to color. And then I needed some hair somehow, because the hair was close to the thread, and the whole thing was all getting, interwoven in a sense. And I was also getting a bit excited by it, and I tried to use my own hair to put onto it. It didn't work, and then it's a long story, but I bought some horse hair that I shampooed and cleaned, and then went through this amazing process of actually sticking it so that the edges of the hair could be seen on top, just sort of as they were, as they had been cut. And then I didn't interfere with them, I just stuck them very straight on the paper and then allowed them to sort of free float. So it's rather a playful piece which I call the enigma of being. I'm afraid this has photographed very badly, and I think it is because of this very sort of intense yellow, because this has very fine lines in it all along the surface, sort of horizontal lines. And this was again close to that idea of skin and the idea of upholds, which you rub on the skin. And I was thinking of that color, that particular kind of ochre color, but of course it changes over here because it becomes slightly more, and it's sort of celebratory because it is usually used at weddings and dulhans and itar in the uktan and all that sort of idea. I called the painting the lingering scent of memory. So these are the kind of ideas and smells and memories and things like that that were happening to me throughout the making of this work. And this painting, similar in terms of technique to that blue painting which I had seen earlier, when I actually started from one corner of the paper, and it's a large size, it's about 30 inches by 44 inches, and just kept cutting and incising into the paper throughout, and then painted it with washes of green and tea wash, interspersed between that. And this was after a poem by Nazish Attaullah. I call the painting Haas ke Hare Samandar, but it is from that line Jab Pujye Boli Haas ke Hare Samandar mein tum yaad aaye. So that was essentially, that's what it was. And I kept this untitled for obvious reasons. Tea wash and another paper behind that that kind of perforation, that sort of piercing right through in the paper, and that particular form, which I don't think I need to necessarily explain to anyone, but I kept it untitled because I thought it was very obvious. And the next one, please. Juxtapositions. This is an idea that I worked with earlier. Again, the idea of the frame within the frame is many artists, at least in this part of the world, have used this particular format within which to make their paintings. But this painting I was trying to resolve with a different sort of an idea, because I too have used a frame within a frame, one frame which stays regular and the frame in the center which keeps changing. That is the kind of thing that I've done in the past. And I think what I did in the past was that regular frame was the kind of structure which is in some ways a rigid structure, which is unchanging. And then the image which is in the center of it is the one which has some more flexibility. So here it was really to do with perhaps with skin and pores and hair, and that was the idea behind it. Right. okay, this is the final painting, and this is called Shine. And in this painting, what happened was that this, as I told you, that what the impetus behind this work, that this is almost, it was like laying the case to rest, because I tied those knots as you do when koi mannat ke jaise knots hote hain, when you go to a shrine and you tie a knot, or you tie a dhaga or something. And I tied these knots and called it Shine because it seemed to me that what I had sustained and what I wanted to do, I had come to terms with it in my own way during the course of this work, and it was like bringing it to a conclusion and resting the case, as it were. So that is it.